Okay, we're going to get going, and what I'm going to talk about is the history of SOF, but I'm going to use artifacts. So the Spy Museum has the world's preeminent collection of intelligence and espionage-related artifacts, just under 10,000 artifacts. And artifacts are really fascinating to me. Think about your daily life, the way that you make your way through the world. All of you now, a water bottle, a laptop, other things, tools that help us make our way through the world. And when we're all long gone, the only thing that will be left will be two-dimensional or three-dimensional objects that leave behind traces of our existence, of our time on this planet. So I think by using these artifacts, you can think in quite interesting ways about SOF. So let me give you an example. So here on the right, Christopher Lonnie Landis, a cryptologist who was attached to to special forces, died in 2014 in Afghanistan. So if you think about it, at one level, this is just a piece of metal. A piece of metal is a piece of metal is a piece of metal. But it's the story that's attached to that piece of metal. I'm sure some of you may have one of these or know someone that does. It's the story, it's the significance, it's the meaning that's attached to it. That's why it's important, not because it's a piece of metal. So let me give you another example. At the Spy Museum, we have the ice axe that was used to kill Leon Trotsky. Now, say like a work of art in the Met in New York. The reason why that's valuable is because Picasso painted it or something. But at our museum, the only reason that this ice axe is significant is because of the story. I mean, maybe if you have an ice axe museum, you can say, you know, this is part of the evolution of ice axes, but it's going to be a pretty boring museum, let's face it. So it's the story that's attached to these artifacts. That's what gives them meaning. So we can see Christopher Lonnie Landis here, a young boy on the left. We see him here down below, in fields, in country up at the top. And then we see his gravestone over to the right. And of course, there's many of these. He's actually buried, quite interestingly, just around 5 minutes away from where Harry Truman is buried. So another Midwestern boy who went off to war, and it profoundly affected his experience. Another example. So on the right here, your right, the famous Sykes Fairbairn fighting knife, which you see Delta Force, many other special operations organizations across the world have this knife. So the one on the right, you're thinking to yourself, okay, well that's, you know, they're cool knives. What if I tell you that this is the knife of Douglas Fairbairn? This is the knife of the guy that invented the knife. Then it's even more interesting, right? This is him here. Now, I would not want to encounter him coming out of a bar in Ybor City at 2 o'clock in the morning. And over here, you can see $3.95 for the Commando knife. If only it was that inexpensive now. Okay, final example. On the right, you see a small cylinder with a tiny piece of water on the top. So a piece of water 71% of this planet that we're on, why the heck would a piece of water matter? It's because of the story that's attached to it. So this is a story we tell in the museum. Operation Gunnerside. Norwegian commandos go and conduct a raid on a plant that the Nazis are using to make heavy water to try to develop the atomic bomb. So one of my favourite Sunday afternoon movies, The Heroes of Telemark. If anybody's not seen it, it's a really great movie. So a piece of water, but it's the story that's attached to that. In the 1930s, German scientists and others know that nuclear weapons are over the horizon, and then it becomes a race. The Manhattan Project, the Nazis, of course, are involved in this, but just a piece of water. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the next little bit is talk about the story of SOF through artifacts. So I can talk to you in abstract terms about that history, but if we ground it in artifacts, then it's something to remember, and it's a way to concretize it. These are things that were used in the past by people, I was going to say like you and I, but mainly like you, who were in the world trying to make their way through it. And I think by doing that, we can reflect on the history of SOF in an interesting and novel way. We can think about it a little bit differently. And then finally, I'm just going to offer a few reflections on its future. And they've actually done studies and shown that if you engage in, say, concepts and have artifacts, so that sensory spatial dimension, if that's added to discussing concepts, it actually triggers parts of your brain that don't normally get used. And I think in the modern world, we've all got parts of our brain that are not getting used in various ways. So that's what I'm going to do for the next little bit. So I'm going to do this. I thought of 100 different ways to structure this. I'm going to use the 4 ages of SOF. So 41 to 60, 61 to 79, 1980 to 2020, and 2021 to who knows when. Okay, so the first age of SOF, so the Second World War. So if we think about it, so I was a grandchild of the Second World War. But growing up in Scotland and Europe, it was really imprinted on my generation. So I wasn't, the child of the people that were in the war, but I was a grandchild. The brothers that were lost, the German planes flying overhead, the toys I played with, the movies I watched. So the Second World War, I'm sure it's the same for all of you here, it's really saturated and imprinted into us. And it's, of course, a very formative period for SOF, for the 4 ages of SOF. So Bill Donovan needs no introduction to this audience. Wild Bill, on the right here, in the First World War, won the Medal of Honor. On the left here, you see him in probably his glory days, Second World War, SOE, OSS. And of course, he's called the father of the CIA. But I think he's the father of a number of other things too. So we've got the leader, Bill Donovan. Then we've got Virginia Hall, very famous, The Limping Lady, A Woman of No Importance, a great book on the topic. You see one of her international driving licenses at the bottom right. At the top, this is her Distinguished Service Order. And she's really interesting for a whole bunch of reasons, because she challenges a lot of gender norms. She challenges a lot of norms about physical disabilities, about what you can do. And interestingly, on the podcast, on the Spy Museum podcast, a couple of years ago, we had an interview with a guy called Rick Diaz. He was formerly in the Air Force. He joined the CIA. He was told, you know, I should put in the important part of the story. He lost his arm in an accident when he was in the Air Force. He joined the CIA. He was told, okay, people like you, you know, this is where you belong. And he was like the Terminator. He just kept coming back and coming back. And eventually, he was the first disabled person to get through the course at the farm. And he talks about this, about the parallels between him and Virginia Hall. So I find this story really, really interesting. And does anybody know, I'm sure some of you do, does anybody know what this is in reference to? So the 1st US Army Group, so an entirely fictitious group that Patton was going to command when the Allies were going to cross at the Pas de Calais, the most obvious crossing point for the Normandy landings. Of course, it was fictitious, but they went to extreme lengths to build up the cover story. At the Spy Museum, we have a dummy inflatable tank. We had a great episode last year on denial and deception. So strategic denial and deception. Really excellent gentleman who was on the Denial and Deception Committee, Bill Parquet, spent a lot of his life studying this. And he speaks about this as a classic example. So denial and deception. So I bring some of these things up, and the history of espionage and intelligence, of course, is one thing, and the history of SOF is to some extent something else. But as you all know better than me, there's lots of areas where they cross over. And in the Second World War, we see a lot of crossover. We don't see the modern special operations units and so forth like we see now. So this is not to say that none of this ever existed, of course, but not in the way that we understand it. Not built up by an industrialized state to perform specific functions or to be there continually. But of course, when the war ends, it all gets disbanded. The OSS goes away. The CIA, not long afterwards, has to be created, the National Security Act. And we all know the rest of the story. So this brings us up to the second age of SOF. So this here, Green Berets, going into Vietnam. So we're talking about a particular point in America's strategic trajectory as well. So the Second World War, America comes in. The European powers and their empires get dismantled largely after the war, or slowly dismantled. And America and the Soviet Union are the two most powerful entities. We have the domino theory, Korea, Vietnam. And of course, we all know the story of Vietnam, but I think that this is really, really interesting for the development of SOF. And some people that I've interviewed for the podcast, it's quite interesting, the people that are purely intelligence, some of them say we should really get back to the OSS days, where intelligence and special operations are much more closely aligned. Some other people say that's the worst possible thing we could do. Of course, there's different positions, But I think it's quite interesting. If we look at these 4 ages of SOF, at what points did they come closer together again, and at what points did they move back apart? So the 3rd age of SOF, the War on Terror, I think we see them coming closer together. So if we think the Green Berets, John F. Kennedy, this is the order that set it up. Of course, there's still an ongoing relationship with the Green Berets, Special Forces, and John F. Kennedy. It's quite an interesting period for a number of reasons, but to me it's also interesting when you talk about institutional evolution. Most people's eyes glaze over, but it's actually really, really fascinating. So if you think about the military, the Veterans Administration, where does that come from? What historical events does that come out of? Where does the CIA come out of? Where do the Green Berets come out of? Of course, we move forward to Eagle Claw. That's another inflection point. And this is one that we have in the museum, which I find really, really interesting. So this is Operation Zapata, also known as the Bay of Pigs. So we see John F. Kennedy presenting this flag to 506, to one of the Cubans that would go there. 2506 is actually deception. So they started numbering at 2,500 to make the figures appear inflated. So we actually have this flag in the International Spy Museum. So we have a collector whose almost his life's work has been to go around the world and seek out all of these awesome artifacts. And we're very lucky because he donated most of them to us. So really interesting as well. And if we think about this type of operation, the CIA is still finding its feet. 1947, we've got the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy inherits it. It's botched, probably feeds into the Cuban Missile Crisis. But this is quite interesting as well in terms of the United States reaching out to try to affect the world itself, or using other forces to try to affect it, or disengaging. So this is something I think that we see in the history of SOF. Like, are we directly being involved? What other strategies are we using to try to put our thumb on the scale? Are we working with local forces? These are also in our collection, which I think are quite interesting. So the information war, psychological operations on the left, this is going out directly to Green Berets specifically. So this is trying to convince them not to fight. And then on the right here, calling cards. So I think this is quite interesting just now as well. If we think about Ukraine, if we think about so many other things, this information battlescape and the role that technology is playing in it. So this is just something that I want to kind of, it's a bear that I want to prod a little bit. So the conventional narrative is Carter was wishy-washy, Reagan came in, had a very muscular foreign policy, unleashed the CIA, unleashed the military, built it up. The Cold War ends and everyone lives happily ever after. So, so I'm not saying that there's nothing to that, but it's a little bit more complicated. So for example, the Rapid Deployment Force is set up by President Carter. Carter goes to the Congress in December 1979 and says, January 1980, and says to the country, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan is the most direct threat to the peace since the Second World War. And any attempt by an outside power to gain power over the Persian Gulf will be repelled by any means, including military force. So this is a real breaking point in Carter's foreign policy. This year, 1979, is really interesting. The US Embassy in Islamabad is burned to the ground. The Iranian Revolution takes place and the hostage crisis ensues. The Soviet Union, for the first time, invades a non-Warsaw Pact country. And as part of the strategic chessboard at this time, this is an area called the Northern Tier. So Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. The theory is that this is the Northern Tier that provides a buffer between the Soviets and the Persian Gulf. US policymakers and Margaret Thatcher, they interpret this as a direct attempt to gain access to warm water ports. The Persian Gulf, the oil jugular vein, as President Nixon calls it, in a book that he wrote in 1980 called The Real War. So I think that so much of what has happened in the world can be traced back to that year, 1979. The Northern Tier crumbles. Carter sets up the Rapid Deployment Force. Not long afterwards, CENTCOM as a successor. The covert action in Afghanistan to provide the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles and money. This actually, the whole thing is in place when Reagan comes to office. The logistical pipeline, the deal with the Saudi intelligence and the Pakistani ISI. The Carter starts it off and then he begins to ramp it up and Reagan comes to power. So we'd never know what Carter would have done if he had stayed in power. But I think just the point that I'm trying to make is that the conventional narrative just needs to be prodded a little bit. Carter is responsible for envisioning an over-the-horizon force that's going to be involved in the security situation in the Persian Gulf. We can think of the Persian Gulf War and then the Iraq War that come afterwards. And he's also involved in the covert action, the Stingers, and in Afghanistan. Quite interestingly, the longest war in the history of the Soviet Union, Afghanistan. And of course, the longest war in the history of the United States, Afghanistan. The British as well, 3 Anglo-Afghan wars. None of them ended particularly well for the British. If anybody's read the very first Sherlock Holmes book, A Study in Scarlet, Dr. Watson talks about how his regiment got a shellacking in Afghanistan. So it's just quite interesting to me. You know, I don't think there's any big conspiracy or anything here, but it's quite interesting to me that 3 of the major powers from the past 200 years have all ended up involved in this landlocked, resource-scarce country. I mean, that's one of the great coincidences. The British at the height of their power come unstuck there. The Soviets. It's difficult for us to understand. In 1979, everybody thought the Soviets were on the march. Nobody saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There's memos from Kissinger talking about the historical correlation of forces is on the Soviet side. Many policymakers are thinking, what the heck is going on? So if we think about the 70s for the US and for SOF, Vietnam, Watergate, the oil crisis, the Malaise speech, the Northern Tier unraveling. So the 70s just seemed to be one setback after another. And then with this invasion of Afghanistan, I think that you see the whole of US policy pivot. And of course, this plays out until the present day, and we can think about the recently concluded wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the third age of SOF. So the Cold War ends, the Berlin Wall comes down. There's this period where it's, what is our purpose? So James Woolsey, the CIA director, he says, we've lost the large dragon, but we have a bewildering variety of poisonous snakes. So this is quite interesting. We think about the 90s and then what happens in 2001. But the Soviets are doing the same thing, or sorry, the Russians, as it happens after 1991, are doing the same thing. Like, what's going on? The GRU, Spetsnaz, some of the same historical symbology they've always used. And we can see this just now. Putin, many of the senior people in the Putin circle, people that were in the KGB, like this loss of a sense of purpose. Like, what are we doing? What's going on? And then, of course, we come up to the two defining wars of the past 20 or so years. Quite interestingly, I just realized this the other day. On March, this coming March is going to be the 20th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War, which I think is quite interesting. So for SOF, a pivot, an interesting pivot as well. So it's quite interesting to me just to see how America's strategic posture and how the American military's role in that posture also affects SOF, what SOF is imagined to be for, what SOF is thought to be doing. So we see here some of the reminders of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this is a ghillie suit that we have. Quite interestingly, a ghillie is it traces back to Scotland and gamekeepers and people hunting in the Highlands and so forth, but quite interesting. And then, of course, the Iraq War. So on the left, this is a flag that CIA and special forces carried into Baghdad in the fall of Baghdad. We come up to 2011. So again, SOF. We can trace that story back, Tora Bora, how did they slip the net, the Green Berets that were in Afghanistan, like pretty much weeks after 9/11. In fact, we interviewed some of them on the podcast just the other year. We can come up to 2011, the death of Osama bin Laden, SEAL Team 6, all of the hullabaloo that surrounded that, how we got him, romancing the SEALs. I used to, when I worked at the 9/11 Museum, one artifact that we had that I found quite interesting was a board that a woman in Brooklyn made. And that board had, it was like the death of Osama bin Laden. And then it was 1 day, 2 days. She got up to 1 year, 2 years, 2 years and 10 days, 2 years and 11 days. She just kept counting it out. And then the artifact stops on the day that the day that Osama bin Laden died. I can't remember the specifics, but it's like 9 years, so many 100 days. And then, of course, the fourth age of SOF. What is going on there? What is that going to look like? So this is actually an artifact we have from 2014. So Vladimir Putin out of Ukraine. So you can imagine my interest when I came across this. Out of Ukraine, 2014. And then on the right here, this was a pseudo-special operations unit of the Cheka back in the Russian Revolution. They were basically an assassination squad. But this idea of Chekis, of Russian intelligence, of this idea about Russia, what Russia is, this lives on I think it's very clear to see in Vladimir Putin. So I'm not saying he's a communist. I'm just saying that this mentality of Russian intelligence that goes back to the early 20th century has continued down, and it's inside the head of Vladimir Putin right now. But of course, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, one of the things that JSOW's doing is what's going on, where are we going, what's going to happen. So on the far right here, we've got a little exhibit on the Trojan War. So the Trojan horse, a great example of deception. And then here we've got a submarine, a submersible submarine that's used to try to get up to enemy ships. You would wear an oxygen helmet, you would get up to an enemy ship, you would attach an explosive, and then you would paddle away. That was the idea. Quite interestingly, during the Revolutionary War, there was a proto-submarine. It's a round cylinder, and the idea was that in the East River in New York, you were going to go up to it, attach a mine, and then paddle away and blow up one of the British ships. The problem was that the air only lasted for 20 minutes. Can anybody make a guess or know how long a submarine can stay underwater for now? Like, imagine that food is not a factor in this. How long could a nuclear submarine stay underwater for? Around about 20, 25 years. So think about that. The Revolutionary War, 200 years later, 20 minutes, 20 years. Think about that change. And this is something that you guys, JSOW, are all reckoning with, the exponential rate of technological change. This is something that Rogers Rangers never had to really concern themselves with. You can see old Robert over on the left, Harriet Tubman on the right. We can see this is from the Mongol armies. They would wear these uniforms to make themselves look bigger. So a lot of this world is about appearing to be one thing, but secretly being something else. It's like the denial and deception operation for D-Day or the Yom Kippur War. You pretend that you're doing one thing, but you're really doing something else. You appear to be one thing, but you're actually something else. And then, of course, on the left, if anybody gets the reference, it's one of the Sand People from Star Wars. And the Sand People have their own deception operation. They always walk in single file so that you can't tell how many of them there are, or so the story goes. This is a drone that we have, or a proto-drone that the Soviets copied from an American effort. And I think that's quite interesting to think about now for intelligence and for SOF. What are the R&D models behind those special forces? Is it steal the other guys? Is it develop your own and always be a step ahead? Is it be the friend of someone that's always going to be a step ahead? So I think that that's quite interesting. If you tie the tip of the spear back to the R&D enterprise that's going on in the background, or even at a more general level, to the economic system. So we can think about this with the Soviet Union. The economic system and how that played out in terms of equipment, mentality, and other things. It's quite interesting. It doesn't neatly map onto the 4 ages of SOF, obviously, but it's quite interesting to think about the age of mechanization, the age of mass production, computer and automation, and then cyber physical systems. So it doesn't map onto the 4 ages of SOF perfectly. There's a little bit of a lag here and there. But if we think about it, cyber physical systems, I think that this is where we're going. So this is one of the big challenges, data overload. We're drowning in the stuff. How do we make sense of it? The tip of the spear needs to be guided in a particular direction. How do we make sense out of all of this noise to guide it? So if we just think about the communications revolution, for millennia, for most of human history, the fastest way to get information anywhere would be jump on a horse and ride as fast as you can, or send a ship. That was the same for Caesar, for Napoleon, for George Washington. But then, in the 19th century, we see these developments take place. The railroad, the telegraph, which of course are very important in the history of this country especially. The telephone, the internet, the smartphone. So if we think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, George Washington, the British would have to send a message to London. It would have to get to London. They would sit and pontificate about it. They would wait on it coming all the way back. And that point, that's months we're talking about. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, because of the communications revolution, because of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the time span is so compressed. We're talking like if a Soviet sub is off the coast of Manhattan, we could be talking 20 minutes or less. So the ability to make mistakes in that narrow window are so much greater. If you think about it, I can't even make a good decision about what to eat for dinner in 20 minutes. Never mind try to ward off nuclear holocaust. So we're just seeing a huge increase in the effect of inputs, their presence, their volume, their permeance. They're with us all the time. Damn iPhones beside your bed, never leaving you alone. Again, the printing press, for many, many millennia, is relatively similar. The printing press revolutionizes information, how it gets distributed, how it flows. This has an effect on the military. The very first newspaper in America. The camera never lies, but does it? And now we're getting into this scary new age of fake people, deep fakes. Some of these things are coming for the intelligence community, but also things that the national security enterprise more generally has to think about. So back to Star Wars. He's more machine than man, twisted and evil. Did anybody ever used to watch this? The Bionic Man. So is that just make-believe? Well, Cyborg Soldier 2050. This is where we're going. Dick Cheney had a pacemaker that was connected up to the internet, but he removed it during the War on Terror because they thought it presented a security risk. So if you've seen Homeland, something happens in that show where the vice president they precipitate a heart attack. So for all of you, if you could have a chip implanted in your head that would detect the proteins that told you that a heart attack was coming, would you want it? A lot of people would. Well, what if somebody can interfere with that? There's so many things. I think now that human beings and machinery are beginning to fuse. Cyborg soldiers. Here's an example here. Experimental brain implant lets man with paralysis turn his thoughts into words. This is just a taste. There's an avalanche coming over the horizon. Famous image by Leonardo da Vinci. It's taking place very, very slowly, but I think that this is where we're going. The fusion of man and machine, human beings and machines. So if you're not convinced by now about the link between objects and our lived reality or history. So remember the meaning that gets attached to something. I just want you to watch this video. This was taken at the Villages over near Orlando, and I think it was around 5 years ago or something.
Any more? All right. All right, I'm going to turn this, give the microphone, and give it over to Danny. Here you go, pal. Hang on. Grab this other battery.
Come on, Dan, you don't need no card.
No, come on. How much?
Don't need a card, you don't need the mic.
Testing. There you go. All right. Repeat after me. I will not take my own life by my own hand. Without talking to my battle buddy first. My mission is to find a mission. To help my warfighter family. God bless. Amen, everybody.
So this is a sword, a Spartan sword, made from steel from the World Trade Center in New York. So this is something that I first came across when I was at the 9/11 Museum. I was investigating the uses of World Trade Center steel, how it was used in the aftermath. So the USS New York, there's pieces of this steel buried in every state around the country. In Afghanistan, the very first casualty, combat casualty, the war on terror, Johnny Mike Spann, former Marine, CIA, paramilitary officer, he's buried in Arlington, but at his grave in Afghanistan, what they done was they wrapped a piece of World Trade Center steel in an American flag and lowered it into the ground. So a piece of World Trade Center steel is in Afghanistan. I think there's no better example of how the whole world is now interconnected through technology, through the shrinking of time and space. So think of that piece of steel in Afghanistan, and then this piece of steel. So again, a piece of steel is a piece of steel. Like, why do we care? Think of the bracelet. But it's the meaning behind this steel. Why would everybody gather in almost religious reverence and touch a sword made of World Trade Center steel? So everybody in this video is either touching it or touching someone that touches it. So it's almost a spiritual event. And they're all making a pledge not to take their own life. So this was a group that was trying to address military suicides. So to me, this is just so interesting. 2,000 years from now, just like we look at ancient Rome and we find something and we say, oh, what does this tell us about them? If the whole world was completely changed as we knew it, and somebody came across this sword buried somewhere in the United States and found it, it's just really interesting to me what meaning they would make from it and the significance that they would attach to this object. So I guess my takeaway is, when you're going about your lives, just think about the power of the objects around you. If you were to tell your life story or the story of your military service in 6 objects, what would you choose? If your house went on fire, what would be the first thing you would grab? Why? I just want you to ask yourselves those questions, just to think a little bit more about the world around you, but also the way that that corridor there is is just overflowing with really interesting artifacts. So the next time you walk down that hall, I just want you to think a little bit about what those can tell you about SOF, the history of SOF, and where SOF is going. Thank you for your time and for your patience.